There are mysteries that fade with time, puzzles softened by the passing of years, their edges worn smooth until they feel more like legend than loss. And then there are mysteries like the Mary Celeste. This one has never faded. It has never softened. It has never been fully explained. And for more than 150 years, it has sat in the back of the human mind like a half-remembered dream. Vivid in its details, impossible in its logic, deeply, quietly unsettling in a way that is very difficult to name. Because what happened to the Mary Celeste did not happen in legend. It did not happen in folklore, or myth, or the embellished pages of a sailor's tall tale. It happened in the cold, documentary record of maritime history. It happened to real people, on a real ship, in the real waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And then, in some profound and terrible sense, it simply stopped happening. The people vanished. The answers vanished with them, and the ship sailed on. She was a brigantine, a two-masted sailing vessel, sturdy and unremarkable by the standards of her day. Built in 1861 in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, she was originally christened the Amazon, and her early years were not kind to her. Her first captain fell ill days after taking command and never recovered. She ran aground. She caught fire. She changed hands repeatedly, carrying with her a quiet reputation for misfortune that sailors, being the superstitious souls they have always been, did not entirely ignore. By 1872, she had been refitted, renamed, and sold to American interests in New York. She was now the Mary Celeste, a name that would become, in time, one of the most famous in all of maritime history, though for reasons no one involved could have possibly anticipated or desired. In October of that year, under the command of Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, a deeply experienced, deeply respected, deeply religious man of 37, the Mary Celeste departed from New York Harbor, bound for Genoa, Italy. She carried 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol in her hold, a crew of 7 experienced sailors, and something that sets this particular voyage apart from so many others lost to history. She carried the captain's family, his wife, Sarah, his 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda. They were going along for the journey, a family voyage across the Atlantic, shared between the rhythms of a working ship and the particular closeness that comes from being out on open water, far from the noise of the world, together. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. On the 4th of December, 1872, 5 weeks after the Mary Celeste had left New York, a Canadian brigantine called the Dei Gratia was making her own crossing of the Atlantic, roughly 600 miles east of the Azores. It was her helmsman who spotted it first, a ship some distance off, moving in a way that didn't look quite right. She was sailing, but she was sailing strangely, yawing and drifting, her course uncertain, the behavior of a vessel with no one at the wheel. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gratia knew Benjamin Briggs. The two men had dined together in New York just weeks before. He ordered a boarding party. What they found when they climbed aboard the Mary Celeste would become one of the most discussed, debated, and deeply puzzling scenes in the history of the sea. The ship was intact. She was seaworthy. Her cargo was largely undisturbed. There was food in the galley. There were personal belongings in the cabins. The captain's logbook, clothing, a child's toy. The crew's pipes were still on the table. Sarah Briggs's harmonium sat in her cabin, her sheet music still open upon it, as though she had simply stepped away for a moment and intended to return. But there was no one there. No captain, no crew, no wife, no 2-year-old daughter. 10 people had been aboard the Mary Celeste when she left New York. Not a single one of them was ever seen again. What followed? In the years, the decades, the century and a half since, has been a slow and restless accumulation of theories, each one attempting to fill the silence that the Mary Celeste left behind. Mutiny, some said. Piracy. A waterspout. A rogue wave, a sudden and catastrophic panic. There were those who whispered of the sea creature mythology of the deep Atlantic. There were those, inevitably, who reached for the supernatural. Arthur Conan Doyle, years before he gave the world Sherlock Holmes, wrote a famous fictionalized account of the mystery, and in doing so, permanently blurred the line between the documented facts of the case and the far wilder stories that grew around them. The truth, if it is out there at all, is quieter than any of those theories, more subtle, more human perhaps, and for that reason somehow more chilling. This is the story of the Mary Celeste. Take your time with it. It has waited this long. Part 2, The People on the Ship. Before we can begin to understand what happened to the Mary Celeste, we must first understand who was on her. This is something that gets lost, sometimes, in the retelling. The ship becomes the story. Her name, her ghost-like reappearance, her eerie, undisturbed silence, and the people aboard her become little more than footnotes, 10 unnamed souls swallowed by the Atlantic, never to be accounted for. It is easy, from the comfortable distance of history, to let them remain that way. Abstract, faceless, simply gone. But they were not abstractions. They were people with histories, with families, with opinions about the weather and preferences at the dinner table, and small ordinary habits that those who loved them would have recognized instantly. And if we're going to spend time with this mystery, genuinely spend time with it rather than simply cataloging its strangeness, then we owe them the effort of being seen. Benjamin Spooner Briggs was not, by any measure, a man who invited disaster. He had been born in 1835 in Wareham, Massachusetts, into a seafaring family of considerable standing. His father, Nathan Briggs, had been a captain. Several of his brothers had been captains. The sea was not a foreign and frightening place to Benjamin Briggs. It was simply the family business, inherited and understood, as natural to him as farming might have been to a man born on the plains of the American interior. By the time he took command of the Mary Celeste in the autumn of 1872, he had been sailing professionally for 17 years and had captained 4 vessels before her. He was known, consistently, across multiple accounts from those who knew him, as a man of exceptional competence, extraordinary steadiness, and an almost unwavering moral seriousness. He did not drink. He did not permit drinking aboard his ships. He held religious services on Sundays, read his Bible with evident sincerity, and was described by those who knew him as deeply, genuinely good. He was also, by all accounts, a man deeply in love with his wife. Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, née Cobb, was 30 years old in the autumn of 1872. She was the daughter of a minister, educated and musical, possessed of the kind of clear-eyed intelligence and quiet strength that shows up consistently in the letters she wrote home, letters that survive to this day and which reveal, without any particular drama, a woman entirely at ease with herself and her life. She played the harmonium. She read widely. She wrote with warmth and precision about the sea, about the weather, about what her daughter had eaten for breakfast and what she had said upon waking. Their daughter, Sophia Matilda, was 2 years old. She is the hardest to think about for very long. The Briggses had an older child, a son named Arthur, 7 years old, who was left at home with his grandmother in Massachusetts while his parents made the Atlantic crossing. This was not unusual for the era, and there is nothing in the surviving correspondence to suggest it was a source of particular anxiety. Sarah's last letter home, written from New York just before the voyage departed, is cheerful, affectionate, full of small domestic detail. She mentions that Sophia is well. She mentions the weather. She signs off with the easy warmth of a woman who expects to write again soon. She never did. The crew of the Mary Celeste were, on the whole, an experienced and reputable group, a fact that would become important later when investigators began reaching for explanations rooted in mutiny or incompetence. There were 7 of them, not counting the captain and his family. Albert Richardson, the first mate, was 28 and recently married. He was Briggs's own choice for the position, a man the captain knew and trusted. The second mate, Andrew Gilling, was a young Danish sailor of 25. The cook, Edward Head, was also newlywed. The remaining 4 crew members, Volkert Lorenzen, Boy Lorenzen, Arian Martens, and Gottlieb Gonderschock, were German sailors, experienced and able-bodied, recruited in New York just before departure. None of them knew, when they stepped aboard in late October of 1872 and watched New York Harbor recede behind them, that they were stepping aboard for the last time. Benjamin Briggs, for his part, seems to have been quietly enthusiastic about the voyage. In a letter to his mother written just before departure, he expressed satisfaction with the ship and with the crew, noting that he hoped the voyage would be a pleasant one. He mentioned the weather. He mentioned Sophia. He signed off with the same ease with which his wife had signed her own final letter, a man who expected, without particular drama, to return. The Mary Celeste departed New York on the 7th of November, 1872, the Dei Gratia, the vessel that would eventually find her, adrift and abandoned, departed 8 days later on the 15th of November, bound for the same destination, Gibraltar, en route to Genoa. The 2 ships were sailing, in effect, the same route, separated by a little over a week. Captain Morehouse of the Dei Gratia and Captain Briggs of the Mary Celeste had, as noted, dined together in New York before either ship departed. They were not strangers. The Atlantic crossing in November is not a gentle undertaking. The North Atlantic in late autumn is a place of serious weather. Deep swells, hard winds, sudden squalls that can shift the character of the sea entirely within the space of an afternoon. Both vessels knew what they were sailing into. Both were crewed by men for whom this kind of sailing was simply the nature of the work. What happened between the 7th of November, the Mary Celeste's departure, and the 4th of December, the day the Dei Gratia found her abandoned, has never been established with any certainty. The ship's log, recovered from the vessel, contains entries up to the 24th of November, placing the Mary Celeste approximately 100 miles from the Azorian island of Santa Maria. After that date, the log is silent. 9 days are simply missing from the record. Whatever happened somewhere in those 9 days, in those waters, beyond the reach of any witness. When the boarding party from the Dei Gratia climbed aboard the Mary Celeste on the 4th of December, they did so carefully. Oliver DeVoe, the Dei Gratia's first mate, led the party. He was an experienced sailor, a steady man, not given to exaggeration. What he reported in the detailed testimony he subsequently gave to the Gibraltar Admiralty Court was precise, measured, and, precisely because of that, deeply strange. The ship was sailing under reduced sail, which suggested that at some point before she was abandoned, the crew had made deliberate adjustments to manage her in rough weather. She had taken on some water, not a catastrophic amount, but a meaningful one. In the lower hold and in the forward accommodations, the bilge pump was not functional. Its leather had been removed or had failed. The binnacle, the housing for the compass, had been knocked from its position. The main hatch was sealed. The fore and lazarette hatches were open. One of the ship's 2 pumps had been sounded, suggesting someone had been monitoring the water level in the hold. The ship's only lifeboat, a yawl, which had been stored on the main hatch, was gone. She had not been swept away by a wave. The lashings showed signs of having been cut or deliberately unfastened. A single length of rope, later estimated to be around 170 feet long, was found trailing from the stern of the ship. One end was secured to the Mary Celeste. The other end was frayed, as though it had been under considerable tension and had simply given way. DeVoe and his party moved through the ship with methodical care. They found the captain's log in the mate's cabin. The final entry dated 24th of November. They found the navigational instruments, the sextant, the marine chronometer, missing from their usual positions, suggesting they had been deliberately taken by whoever had left the ship. They found the ship's register and other papers gone as well. What they did not find was any sign of violence. No blood, no damage to the interior of the ship that could not be explained by weather, and the general disorder of a vessel that had been sailing without human direction for some period of time. There was no sign of struggle, no broken furniture, no overturned lanterns. Nothing to suggest that what had happened here had been sudden or brutal or imposed from the outside. Whatever had driven 10 people off the Mary Celeste had not been a battle. It had been something else entirely. The investigation that followed was thorough, contentious, and ultimately inconclusive. 3 qualities that have defined every official inquiry into this case across the generations since. The Mary Celeste was brought into Gibraltar by the Dei Gratia's crew, who were hoping, quite reasonably, for salvage compensation. What they received instead was something closer to suspicion. The British Admiralty Court's investigator, a man named Frederick Solly Flood, was a barrister of considerable self-confidence and, it must be said, considerable imaginative energy. He did not look at the evidence and see a puzzle. He looked at it and saw a crime. Flood became convinced and pursued this conviction with great tenacity, regardless of where the evidence actually pointed, that what had happened aboard the Mary Celeste was murder. He theorized that the Dei Gratia's crew had somehow conspired with the Mary Celeste's crew to kill the captain and his family, seize the cargo, and then stage an abandonment. This theory required, among other things, that Captain Morehouse, who had dined with Briggs just weeks earlier, who knew him personally, who by all accounts had no motive whatsoever, had orchestrated the killing of his friend's wife, and his friend's 2-year-old daughter. The evidence did not support this. The Admiralty Court ultimately agreed that it did not support this. Salvage was awarded to the Dei Gratia's crew, though at a fraction of what they had hoped for, a fact that speaks perhaps to the lasting power of Flood's suspicions over the court's imagination, if not its legal reasoning. But the murder theory, despite being officially rejected, was not entirely without consequence. It introduced something into the public understanding of the Mary Celeste that would prove very difficult to remove. The idea that what had happened here was not simply a tragedy, but a crime. Not simply a mystery, but a cover-up. And once that idea was in the air, it was impossible to fully dispel, because it gave the mystery a human villain. And human beings, as a general rule, find it far easier to be frightened of other human beings than of the cold, indifferent sea. Flood eventually turned his suspicions specifically toward the barrels of commercial alcohol in the Mary Celeste's hold. 9 of the 1,700 barrels, when inspected, were found to be empty and made of red oak rather than the white oak used for the remainder. Red oak is more porous. The 9 barrels had almost certainly leaked, and in doing so had almost certainly introduced a significant volume of alcohol vapor into the enclosed space of the hold. This detail would become, in the decades since, one of the most important clues in the entire case, not because of what it proved. It proved nothing, not definitively, but because of what it suggested. It suggested that whatever had happened aboard the Mary Celeste might have begun not with violence, not with mutiny, not with any human failure of character or judgment, but with something as quiet and invisible as a smell, a particular, concentrated, dangerous smell, rising from the hold of a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 3 weeks out of New York, far beyond the reach of any help, the smell of something that might be about to explode. We will come to the theories in their proper time. Each one deserves attention. Each one contains something real or something possible, or at the very least something that tells us about the particular fears and assumptions of the era in which it was proposed. But before we arrive at the theories, there is one more thing worth sitting with. Somewhere in the 9 missing days between the 24th of November and the 4th of December, 1872, 10 people made a decision. Whatever drove them to make it: fear, panic, the certainty of imminent danger, some kind of pressure we cannot now reconstruct. They made it together, and they acted on it, and they climbed into a single lifeboat and left a perfectly seaworthy ship behind them on the open Atlantic. They had a rope, 170 feet of it, trailing behind the Mary Celeste, connecting them to her. At some point, that rope broke, and then they were alone on the ocean, in a lifeboat, with no ship, and nothing around them in any direction but water. What happened after that, history has never told us. The Atlantic gave nothing back. No wreckage, no bodies, no personal effects washed ashore on some distant island. Nothing. Just the ship, sailing on without them, patient and indifferent, carrying all their belongings still carefully stowed, their food still in the galley, Sarah Briggs's sheet music still open on the harmonium, as though the ocean itself had simply pressed pause on a life and forgotten to press play again. Part 3. The theories. Human beings are not comfortable with unanswered questions. This is not a character flaw. It is, in many ways, one of our most defining and admirable qualities: the refusal to accept the void, the instinct to reach into darkness and feel around for something solid, something that makes sense, something that restores the world to the orderly place we need it to be. It is the same impulse that built science, that built philosophy, that built every religion that has ever offered a grieving person a reason for what happened to someone they loved. But it also means that when a mystery is genuinely unsolvable, when the evidence is incomplete and the witnesses are gone and the ocean has kept its counsel absolutely, we do not simply sit with the silence. We fill it. We fill it with whatever materials are closest to hand. The fears of our particular moment in history, the assumptions of our culture, the specific shape of our imagination on the day we first encounter the story. The Mary Celeste has been filled with more theories than perhaps any other mystery in maritime history. Some of them are careful and methodical, grounded in seamanship and physics and the documented facts of the case. Some of them are wild, spectacular, and almost entirely untethered from the evidence. All of them, in their own way, tell us something. If not always about what happened on that ship, then at least about the people doing the theorizing. Let us begin with the one that comes closest, most historians now agree, to something like the truth: the alcohol vapor theory. We have already noted the 9 barrels. Of the 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol loaded into the Mary Celeste's hold in New York, 9 were found empty upon inspection in Gibraltar. These 9 were made of red oak, a softer, more porous wood than the white oak used for the remainder, and they had almost certainly leaked during the voyage, releasing their contents as vapor into the sealed, enclosed space below decks. Alcohol vapor is not, by itself, explosive, but it is, under the right conditions, extraordinarily dangerous. Concentrated in an unventilated space, it can reach what chemists call the lower flammability limit, the point at which, if introduced to an open flame or even a significant spark, it will ignite, not necessarily with a catastrophic explosion, not necessarily with a fire that consumes everything in its path, but with a force powerful enough to blow open a hatch, to produce a sudden, alarming, deeply convincing impression that the entire ship is about to detonate. This is the theory first seriously advanced in the 1970s by the American writer Charles E.D. Fay, and subsequently developed and refined by a number of maritime historians and, most notably, by researchers at the University of London who, in 2006, actually conducted a practical experiment. They recreated the conditions of the Mary Celeste's hold as accurately as possible and introduced a controlled ignition source. What they produced was precisely what the theory predicts: a loud, dramatic combustion event, a roar, a rush of flame that left, when it was over, no lasting evidence of burning, no scorch marks, No charred wood. Nothing that a subsequent investigator would necessarily identify as a fire. This is crucial, because one of the persistent objections to any fire-based theory of the Mary Celeste has always been the absence of burn damage aboard the ship. If there had been a fire, investigators reasoned, there would be evidence of a fire. But the alcohol vapor theory answers this objection directly and elegantly. The kind of vapor ignition these 9 leaking barrels could have produced would have burned fast, burned clean, and left almost nothing behind. A flash, not a fire. A warning, not a conflagration. Now imagine you are Benjamin Briggs. You are 3 weeks out of New York. You are in the Atlantic, somewhere near the Azores. The weather has been difficult. This is documented. And you have been monitoring your ship with the careful attention of an experienced captain who takes his responsibilities seriously. And then, from somewhere below your feet, there is a sound. A percussive, violent, entirely unexpected sound, and a rush of something, heat or force or both, that bursts from the forward hatch with enough power to convince you, in that instant, that your ship's hold is on fire, and that the remaining 1,691 barrels of alcohol are about to go with it. You do not know, in that moment, that the fire has already burned itself out. You do not know that there is no ongoing combustion, no spreading flame working its way through the cargo. What you know is what your senses have just told you. That something catastrophic has happened in the hold of your ship, and that you have your wife and your 2-year-old daughter aboard, and that the accepted maritime wisdom of your era, wisdom absorbed through years of professional experience, is that an alcohol fire on a cargo vessel is a death sentence. You make a decision. You make it quickly, because quickly is the only way there is to make a decision like this. You get everyone into the lifeboat. You take the navigational instruments, the chronometer, the sextant, because you will need them to find your way back to civilization once the ship has gone up. You take the ship's papers. You attach a long rope to the stern of the Mary Celeste and you hold on to the other end, because you are not ready to entirely abandon the possibility that the fire might not spread, that the ship might survive, that you might be able to get back aboard once you are certain the danger has passed. You wait. The ship does not explode. The fire does not spread, because the fire has already done all it is going to do. The hold is quiet. The Mary Celeste sails on, steady and intact, perhaps 100 feet ahead of you. And then, at some point, in some sea condition we cannot now reconstruct, the rope breaks, 170 feet of line frayed at the end, under tension. In the North Atlantic, in late November, in weather we know from the logs was difficult, it breaks, and suddenly the gap between the lifeboat and the ship is no longer 170 feet. It is 200 feet, then 300. Then, with the wind and the current doing what the wind and the current do, it is a mile, and the Mary Celeste is a shape on the horizon, and then she is gone. A small lifeboat. Open water. 10 people, including a 2-year-old child. No ship. The North Atlantic, in late November, does not offer much in the way of second chances. This theory is not proven. It is important to say that clearly and hold it in mind as we proceed. It is the most plausible explanation we currently have. It fits the physical evidence. It fits the psychology of the decision-making. It fits the documented condition of the cargo. But it is not, and perhaps never can be, established fact. The 9 missing days will not give back their secrets simply because we have constructed a compelling argument about what they might have contained, and so the other theories deserve their hearing. The waterspout theory. Waterspouts, the maritime equivalent of tornadoes, columns of rotating water and air that can reach from the surface of the ocean to the base of the clouds above, are uncommon in those latitudes, but they are not unknown. And a waterspout, depending on its size and proximity, can do extraordinary things to a vessel caught in its path or near it. Some researchers have proposed that the Mary Celeste encountered a waterspout, possibly while hove to in rough weather, and that the resulting chaos, the sudden violent motion of the ship, the walls of water, the noise and disorientation, convinced the crew that the vessel was foundering. A waterspout does not need to make direct contact with a ship to create the impression of imminent catastrophe. The wave action it generates, the abrupt atmospheric pressure changes, the sheer sensory overwhelm of a major meteorological event at close range. These things are enough, in the right circumstances, to convince experienced sailors that their ship is going down. The weakness of this theory is the absence of structural damage. A waterspout encounter serious enough to panic. An experienced captain into abandoning a sound ship would typically leave some evidence on the ship itself. Damaged rigging, broken spars, disrupted cargo. The Mary Celeste showed relatively little of this. She was disheveled, certainly, in the way of a vessel that had been sailing unmanned through rough weather for some days. But she was not structurally damaged in the way a close-range waterspout encounter might be expected to produce. The seaquake theory, rather more interesting and considerably less discussed, is the seaquake theory. First proposed seriously in the 1990s and developed with some care by researchers examining the seismic record of the North Atlantic for the relevant period. A seaquake is an underwater earthquake, a seismic event occurring on the ocean floor that transmits its energy upward through the water column and into any vessel sitting on the surface above. For a ship at sea, a seaquake can produce an extraordinarily violent and disorienting experience, a sudden, powerful shuddering of the hull, a sensation of the ship striking something solid, a noise described by those who have survived such encounters as resembling a massive explosion directly beneath the keel. A seaquake will explain the panic. It will explain the sudden, urgent decision to abandon a ship that showed no lasting structural damage. It would explain the haste, the food left mid-preparation, the instruments taken but the personal belongings left behind, because the sensation of a seaquake with no visible cause and no warning is precisely the kind of experience that produces pure, instinctual flight rather than rational, organized evacuation. The seismic record for the relevant period in the relevant area of the North Atlantic is, unfortunately, incomplete. We cannot confirm that a seaquake occurred in the path of the Mary Celeste during those 9 undocumented days, but we cannot rule it out either. The ocean floor in that region of the Atlantic is geologically active. It has produced seismic events before and since, the darker theories. And then there are the theories that do not reach for weather or physics or the behavior of leaking barrels. The mutiny theory has never fully gone away, despite the lack of any supporting evidence. It was Frederick Solly Flood's preferred explanation, stripped of his specific accusation against the Dei Gratia's crew and redirected toward the Mary Celeste's own sailors. In this version of events, one or more of the crew turned against Captain Briggs, motivated by what grievance is never convincingly specified, killed him, killed his family, killed or disposed of the remaining loyal crew members, and then, overcome by guilt or fear or some failure of nerve, abandoned the ship themselves and were subsequently lost at sea. This theory requires us to believe several things for which there is simply no evidence. It requires us to believe that experienced sailors, recruited in New York with good references and no known grievances, turned murderers within the first weeks of an unremarkable commercial voyage. It requires us to account for the total absence of blood or physical signs of struggle anywhere on the ship. It requires a level of coordination and shared malice among a group of largely unacquainted men that strains credulity. It also requires us to believe that 7 experienced sailors, having successfully murdered a captain and his family and disposed of all evidence, then chose to sit in an open lifeboat in the North Atlantic in November rather than simply sail the ship to wherever they intended to go, which is, on reflection, not the most compelling criminal strategy. The piracy theory faces similar difficulties. No evidence of external boarding was found on the Mary Celeste, no damage consistent with a pirate attack, no missing cargo of any value. The alcohol was largely intact, and the specific waters in which the ship was found abandoned were not, in 1872, a known theater of pirate activity. The legend that grew. There is one more theory, or rather, one more layer of distortion, that deserves acknowledgement because it has done more than any other single factor to muddy the waters of this case and make the genuine mystery harder to see clearly. In 1884, a young writer named Arthur Conan Doyle, 12 years before he would publish the first Sherlock Holmes novel, published a short story in a British magazine called Cornhill. The story was called J. Habakkuk Jepson's Statement, and it was presented with deliberate ambiguity as the first-hand account of a survivor of the Mary Celeste disaster. It was fiction. Conan Doyle made this clear eventually, though not as clearly or as promptly as he perhaps should have. The story was enormously successful. It was also, in several key respects, wrong. Not wrong about the real mystery, which Conan Doyle had no way of solving, but wrong about the documented facts of the case, which were already part of the official record. He changed the name of the ship. He invented survivors. He introduced a cast of characters and a resolution involving racial violence and a conspiracy of remarkable complexity that had no connection whatsoever to anything the Admiralty Court had actually established. None of this stopped readers from accepting it as broadly true. And the details of Conan Doyle's story, the half-eaten meal still warm on the table, the cups of tea still steaming, the ship found mid-voyage as though the crew had simply been plucked from the deck by an invisible hand, migrated from the fiction into the popular understanding of the case, where they have lived stubbornly ever since. The half-eaten meal was not in any official account. The cups of tea do not appear in DeVoe's testimony. These are the inventions of a gifted storyteller writing a popular magazine piece. And they matter, because they replace the actual details of the actual mystery with something more dramatic, more cinematic, more immediately satisfying to the imagination. And the actual details, the leaking barrels, the frayed rope, the missing lifeboat, the 9 days of silence in the log, are, in their quiet way, far more interesting, far more human, and far more terrible, because they do not point toward the supernatural or the conspiratorial. They point toward something much simpler and much harder to bear. They point toward a decision made in panic, on a ship in the middle of the ocean, by a man trying to protect the people he loved. A decision that turned out, in ways he could not have known and cannot have intended, to be the last decision he ever made. The ocean does not require monsters. It has never required monsters. It is quite frightening enough on its own. Part 4. What became of everything. After there is a particular quality to the silence that follows, a mystery, a heaviness, a sense of interrupted momentum, as though the world paused at the moment of the disappearance and has never quite resumed its normal rhythm in that specific place. We feel it in the archive, in the gaps between official documents, in the careful, neutral language of Admiralty reports, trying to describe something for which the official language of Admiralty reports was simply not designed. But the world did not pause, of course. It never does. The inquiry in Gibraltar concluded. The salvage was awarded. The lawyers went home. And the Mary Celeste, as ships must, went back to sea. This is the part of the story that tends to get left out. We speak of the Mary Celeste as though she were a fixed point, a ship found adrift, examined, discussed, and then preserved in amber as a historical curiosity, a monument to the unknown. But she was not preserved in amber. She was a working vessel, a commercial investment, and she had a life to get on with, regardless of what had happened aboard her, and regardless of the fact that no one had been able to explain it. After the Gibraltar inquiry wrapped up in the spring of 1873, the Mary Celeste was returned to her American owners, and her cargo of alcohol, still largely intact, still 1,700 barrels minus 9, was delivered, albeit very late, to its intended destination in Genoa. Someone, somewhere, received that shipment, signed for it, put it to whatever commercial use had originally been intended, and gave no further thought to the ship that had carried it across the Atlantic with a ghost crew for the final leg of its journey. The ship changed hands repeatedly in the years that followed. 17 different owners by some counts across the decade between her discovery and her end. This is itself a kind of data point. Sailors are not, as a profession, inclined toward irrationality. They are practical people whose lives depend on clear-eyed assessments of risk. But they are also people who spend their working lives in a domain large enough and indifferent enough to sustain a healthy respect for things they cannot explain. The Mary Celeste had a reputation now, not the kind that helps a vessel hold its value. She carried coal, she carried fish, she carried whatever cargo her successive owners could find for her in the ports of the American Northeast, trying to make her pay in the way that working ships must pay, trying to extract commercial utility from a vessel that had become, in some indefinable way, uncomfortable. There is no official record of any of her subsequent crews refusing to sail on her, or of any specific incident during those 12 years that could be attributed to anything other than ordinary maritime bad luck. But the ship changed hands 17 times in a decade. The market was expressing an opinion. It ended in Haiti. On the 3rd of January 1885, the Mary Celeste, by then owned by a consortium that included a Boston businessman named Gilman Parker, was deliberately run aground on a reef called Rocheloa Bank off the coast of Haiti in what was transparently, almost insultingly obviously, an insurance fraud. Parker had overinsured the ship and her cargo, taken out policies that far exceeded the actual value of what was aboard, and then, in what remains one of the more brazen examples of maritime fraud in the historical record, sailed her onto the rocks and walked away. The cargo that was subsequently recovered from the wreck was found to be largely worthless. Rubber boots, cat food, and other low-value goods had been substituted for the expensive items listed on the manifest. The fraud was detected almost immediately. Parker was tried. His co-conspirators were tried. The case collapsed before sentencing on a legal technicality, but Parker's reputation was destroyed, his business was ruined, and he died within months of the trial's conclusion. Though whether from shame, from stress, or simply from the ordinary workings of a body that had reached its limit, is not recorded. The Mary Celeste herself, or what remained of her, the broken hull on the reef at Rocheloa Bank, was left where she had been run aground. The sea, with its customary patience, did the rest. She was found again, in a sense, in 2001. A research team led by the American novelist Clive Cussler, who made a career of finding things the ocean had tried to keep, located what they believed to be the remains of the Mary Celeste off the Haitian coast, partially buried in the reef she had been driven onto 116 years earlier. The identification was not universally accepted by maritime historians, and the physical evidence was too degraded to be conclusive. But there was something fitting about the attempt, something in the human need to close the loop, to find the ship one more time, to stand over what remains of her and say, here is where it ended. What did not end, of course, was the mystery. Mysteries of this particular kind, the ones with a clean central image, a compelling human cast, and a resolution that refuses to arrive, do not end. They evolve. They accumulate layers of interpretation and misinterpretation, of serious scholarship and popular mythology, until the original event sits at the center of its own legend, like a stone at the center of a pearl, transformed by accretion into something far larger and more complex than the thing that started it. The Mary Celeste became, in the decades after her discovery, one of the foundational texts of a certain kind of storytelling. The story in which the ocean takes people and gives no explanation back. She was cited in the early literature of the Bermuda Triangle, that geographical fiction which accumulated ships and planes and mysteries throughout the 20th century, like a magnet accumulates iron filings. She was discussed in books about the paranormal, about alien abduction, about the hidden forces operating beneath the surface of the visible world. She was referenced in films and novels and magazine articles so numerous that it would be tedious to attempt an accounting of them. None of this served the actual mystery particularly well. The accretion of legend made it harder, not easier, to see what was genuinely strange and genuinely unexplained about the case, which is, when you strip away the embellishments, something rather specific and rather human, not a supernatural event, not a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication. Just 10 people in a boat, a rope under tension, and the North Atlantic doing what the North Atlantic does. The Briggs family, in the years after the disappearance, grieved in the way that families grieve when there is no body, no confirmation, no final chapter. Which is to say, they grieved incompletely, with a part of the wound always left open. Benjamin's mother lived for many years after her son's disappearance, his son Arthur, 7 years old when his father, mother, and baby sister sailed out of New York Harbor for the last time, grew up, became a man, built a life. He died in 1935, 63 years after the voyage, never having received any explanation of what had happened to his family. There is a small memorial in Marion, Massachusetts, the town where the Briggs family was rooted. It is not a dramatic thing. A stone, a name, the simple record of lives lived, and a death unconfirmed. The kind of memorial that marks an absence rather than a presence, that says, someone was here and then was not, and we could not find a better way to mark that than this. Sarah Briggs's letters are held in various collections, transcribed and available to researchers. They are, as noted, clear and warm and entirely ordinary. The correspondence of a woman who expected her life to continue, who was making plans, who had opinions about the weather and the quality of the provisions, and the particular way her daughter laughed at something she found funny. There is nothing in them that foreshadows anything. There is no premonition, no unease, no sense of a woman who felt, on any level she could articulate, that something was wrong. This too is part of what makes the Mary Celeste so difficult to set down. The ordinariness of the before, the complete and total rupture of the after, and between them, 9 days of silence in a ship's log and the open Atlantic, and a rope that frayed and gave way. In 2022, 150 years after the voyage, a team of maritime historians and forensic researchers published what stands as the most comprehensive modern analysis of the case. They worked with the original Admiralty documents, with contemporary weather records, with the seismic data for the relevant period, and with modern understanding of alcohol vapor dynamics and combustion behavior. Their conclusion, reached carefully, hedged appropriately, offered with the intellectual honesty that serious scholarship requires, was that the alcohol vapor explanation remains the most coherent account of the physical evidence, not proven, but coherent, consistent with what the ship showed, consistent with what the crew would have known and feared, consistent with the specific decisions, the missing chronometer, the trailing rope, the sealed main hatch, that the physical evidence suggests were made in those final moments before the lifeboat was lowered. The report was thorough, measured, and received respectful attention in the communities of maritime history and forensic scholarship. It did not, particularly, capture the public imagination, which tells you something about the public imagination and perhaps something about the nature of truth, that it tends to be quieter, more specific, more hedged with uncertainty than the stories we prefer to tell ourselves about the things we cannot explain. We come then to the question that every serious engagement with this mystery eventually arrives at, not the question of what happened. We have examined that as carefully as the evidence allows, and we have found the most likely answer, and it is a sad and human one. But the deeper question of why this particular mystery has endured the way it has, why the Mary Celeste, of all the ships lost in all the oceans in all the centuries of maritime history, became the one we cannot stop returning to. The answer, I think, lies in the rope, not in the ghost ship, not in the abandoned meal, which was not, as we have established, quite as Conan Doyle described it, though it was abandoned nonetheless, not in the supernatural or the conspiratorial or the dramatically unknowable. In the rope, 170 feet of line, trailing from the stern of the Mary Celeste, connecting the ship to the lifeboat. Under tension, in rough water, and at some point, in some swell, in some gust, in some entirely ordinary moment of the kind that the North Atlantic produces by the thousands in the course of a November day, it gave way. That moment, that specific, unwitnessed, unrecorded, entirely accidental moment, that is where the 10 people aboard the Mary Celeste were lost, not to a monster, not to a conspiracy, not to the supernatural machinations of a universe with malicious intent, to a rope that was under too much tension in too rough a sea. There is something in that, in the sheer smallness of it, the sheer randomness of it, that the mind resists. We want the end of 10 lives to be commensurate with what it means to lose them. We want it to be large. We want a reason of appropriate weight and drama and intention. The North Atlantic does not provide reasons. It provides conditions. And the conditions, on some unremarked afternoon in late November of 1872, somewhere in the waters east of the Azores, were simply this: a rope, a swell, a moment of tension that exceeded what the fibers could bear, and then nothing. Nothing in either direction, ship or boat, but open water, and the wind, and the extraordinary, terrible indifference of the sea. Part 5. What the sea keeps there is a word in Portuguese, saudade, that has resisted clean translation into English for as long as the two languages have been in contact with each other. It describes a particular quality of longing, not the sharp, specific longing for something you know you have lost, but the softer, more diffuse ache for something you can no longer quite reach. Something that may have existed, or may only have been imagined, or may exist still, somewhere, in a form you cannot access. A presence felt precisely through its absence. A love made most vivid by the impossibility of its object. Sailors have always understood this feeling, even those who did not have a word for it. The sea produces it, almost inevitably, in the families left behind on shore, in the men and women watching a horizon that gives nothing back, in anyone who has ever stared at the surface of deep water and understood, in the wordless way that such understandings arrive, that what lies beneath it is beyond knowing. The Mary Celeste is, in this sense, a vessel full of saudade. She carries it the way she carried her cargo, sealed in the hold, invisible from the outside, only apparent when you get close enough to notice the weight. We have spent time in these pages with the evidence, with the theories, with the documented facts and the documented absences of facts. We have tried to be honest about what is known and what is not, about what the physical record of the ship can support and what it cannot, about the difference between a compelling explanation and a proven one. But there is something that the evidence cannot fully address, and it seems right, in this final chapter, to give it the attention it deserves. It is the question of what it was like. Not what happened. We have done our best with that. But what it was like, in the living, breathing, moment-by-moment sense. What it felt like to be on that ship, in those days, in that sea. What it felt like to make the decision that was made, and to be in the lifeboat after it was made, and to watch the Mary Celeste moving away in the grey November light while the rope paid out behind her, growing taut, holding, and then not holding. We cannot know this. We will never know this. The ocean did not preserve those experiences the way it preserved the ship, but we can approach it. We can sit with it for a little while, quietly, without rushing toward resolution, and let it be what it is. The story of 10 people in an impossible situation, doing what they believed was necessary, and finding at the end of it that the ocean had not finished with them yet. Think of Benjamin Briggs in that lifeboat. He is 37 years old. He has been at sea for 17 years. He has captained 4 vessels before this one, has navigated storms and swells and all the ordinary and extraordinary dangers that the North Atlantic presents to those who make their living on it. He is not a man given to panic. The accounts of him, from the people who knew him, from the letters he wrote, from the professional record he left behind, are unanimous on this. He was steady. He was competent. He was the kind of man who, in a crisis, does not become less himself but more. And yet, he is in the lifeboat. He made the decision. He gave the order, or he agreed to it, or he was convinced of its necessity by whatever it was that erupted from the hold of his ship on some morning in late November. He got his wife and his daughter into the boat. He got his crew into the boat. He attached the rope, and he held the other end. And he watched the Mary Celeste moving ahead of him, intact, unhurried, entirely indifferent to the drama of the moment. What was he thinking? Almost certainly. And this is the part that is most difficult to sit with. He was thinking that the decision was temporary, that the danger would pass, or would become apparent in its passing, and that he would be able to get back aboard. The rope is the evidence of this. A man who had decided to permanently abandon his ship does not trail 170 feet of line behind it. The rope is the evidence of a man who had not given up, who was watching, who was waiting for the moment when it became safe to return. And then the rope broke, and whatever he thought in the moment after that, in the first seconds of understanding that the gap was now beyond the power of any line to bridge, we cannot know. We can only say that he was a man who loved his wife, who had brought her on this voyage for the pleasure of her company, who had not sent her home with their son because he had wanted her with him on the water, and she was in the boat beside him, holding their daughter, and the ship was moving away, and the November sea was doing what the November sea does. Think of Sarah Briggs. She is 30 years old. She has Sophia in her arms, or near her, in the boat. She is the daughter of a minister and the wife of a captain, and she is a woman of considerable intelligence and inner resource, as her letters make plain. She has been on ships before. She is not unfamiliar with rough water, with the particular combination of confinement and exposure that an open lifeboat in the North Atlantic represents. She watched the rope break, or she did not see it break and only understood what had happened when she looked and found the Mary Celeste too far ahead to reach. Her harmonium is on that ship, her sheet music, the things she brought for the voyage, the small domestic items that make a ship's cabin livable, that make an ocean crossing feel less like endurance and more like simply being somewhere else. All of it is moving away from her, unhurried, carried by a ship that needs no one to sail it. Her last letter home had been cheerful. She had expected to write again from the other side of the ocean. She had expected, in the way that healthy, purposeful people in the middle of their lives always expect, to continue. The ocean did not consult her expectations. Think of Sophia Matilda Briggs, 2 years old. There is almost nothing to be said about this that does not simply land with a dull, unprocessable weight. She is the reason, perhaps, why the Mary Celeste stays with people the way it does. Why, even after all the theorizing and all the scholarship and all the measured, careful work of historical investigation, there remains a residue that cannot be dissolved by explanation. Something that sits in the chest, unresolved, when you close the last book on the subject and return to the ordinary business of your day. She had been on a ship before. She was the daughter and granddaughter of sea captains. The motion of a vessel was not strange to her. She had been to sea at an age when such things become simply part of the texture of the world, simply the way things are. And she had been brought along on this particular voyage because her parents wanted her with them, because the pleasure of her company on the water outweighed, in their calculation, whatever risks the crossing entailed. She is the one for whom there is no frame, no professional competence to reach for, no maritime experience to draw on, no inner resource cultivated over years of practiced self-reliance. She was 2 years old, in a lifeboat, in the North Atlantic, in November, with her mother and her father and 7 sailors she barely knew, watching a ship sail away. That is all that can be said. The Mary Celeste sailed on for 11 days after the boarding party from the Dei Gratia brought her into Gibraltar. 11 days, unmanned, unguided, doing what the wind and the current directed, carrying her cargo, her log, her navigational instruments, and the absence of the people who had sailed her, across the last stretch of water between her and the Strait of Gibraltar. She was not distressed. She was not foundering. She had taken on water, certainly, but she was managing it in the passive way of a well-built vessel, holding her own, keeping enough buoyancy, declining to sink. There is something almost willed about this, though of course there was no will involved. She was a collection of wood and rope and canvas, entirely subject to the physics of her situation. But the Mary Celeste behaved, in those 11 days, exactly as though she intended to be found. She did not drift south into warmer waters and disappear. She did not founder in the rough November seas. She sailed, approximately, in the direction she had been pointed when her crew left her, maintaining enough of her course that the Dei Gratia, following the same route 8 days behind, encountered her in exactly the place where such an encounter was possible. She wanted, in the metaphor that the mind instinctively reaches for, to tell the story. She wanted the evidence preserved, the log delivered, the mystery, however unsolvable, at least established and documented, and handed to the world as a puzzle worth taking seriously. In this sense, she succeeded entirely. What does it mean to take this mystery seriously? It means holding, simultaneously, the two things that the Mary Celeste most insistently presents: the near certainty of the explanation and the absolute irreducibility of the loss. The explanation, the leaking barrels, the vapor, the panic, the lifeboat, the rope, is as close to truth as the evidence is likely to bring us. It is not dramatic. It does not require a monster, or a conspiracy, or a supernatural intervention. It requires only that we accept the sea as it actually is, rather than as we sometimes prefer to imagine it, not a stage for the extraordinary, but an environment of almost limitless indifference, in which ordinary physical processes, a porous barrel, a concentration of vapor, a length of rope under tension in rough water, can accumulate into outcomes of irreversible devastation. And the loss is, and remains, and will always remain, the loss of 10 specific people. A captain who was steady and devout and good, his wife who played the harmonium and wrote letters full of warmth and precision, their daughter who was 2 years old and had her whole life in front of her, and whose name, Sophia Matilda, sounds, when you say it, like the kind of name given to a child who is genuinely loved, 7 sailors who left families and expectations and ordinary futures in New York, and who ended up in a lifeboat in November, and whose names are preserved in the Admiralty record and in nothing else. These two things do not resolve each other. The explanation does not diminish the loss. The loss does not make the explanation false. They simply exist together, as they have always existed. The known and the unknowable, the physical and the human, the what and the what it meant. And the space between them is the space in which the mystery lives. The ocean is very old. It is older than the ships that sail it, older than the people who sail them, older by orders of magnitude than the entire human project of naming things and explaining them and filing the explanations in Admiralty courts in Gibraltar. It was here before we were, and it will be hereafter, and in the interim it has accepted from us, with the absolute equanimity of something that does not experience acceptance, an almost uncountable number of ships and people and mysteries and questions and prayers and ropes pulled taut and then let go. It has kept most of what it has taken. This is simply what oceans do. They are not malicious. They are not indifferent in the conscious sense of a mind turned away. They are indifferent in the way that physics is indifferent, in the way that the universe is indifferent, which is to say, completely and without exception and with no possibility of appeal. The Mary Celeste is one of the things the ocean did not keep, or not entirely. It kept the people. It kept the 9 days. It kept the answer, whatever the answer finally is, sealed inside the silence of the log after the 24th of November, 1872. But it gave back the ship, and the ship gave back enough. The barrels, the rope, the chronometer missing from its place, the sheet music open on the harmonium, to let us sit here 150 years later and piece together the shape of what we cannot see directly, to triangulate the truth from its shadows, to understand, approximately, what happened, even if we cannot know what it was like. That is what the Mary Celeste gave us, not an answer, but the materials for an approximation of one, not resolution, but the specific, carefully documented shape of the unresolved, a mystery that taught us, if we were willing to learn it, the difference between a question that cannot be answered and a question that has not yet been answered well enough, and how to hold both kinds with equal seriousness, equal patience, equal respect for the complexity of a world that does not always organize itself around our need to understand it. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, somewhere in the deep water east of the Azores, in waters that are cold and dark and very far from any shore, the last chapter of the Mary Celeste story was written. It was written without witnesses. It was written in the language of weather and current and the physics of small boats in rough seas, a language that leaves no archive, no document, no Admiralty record. It was written quickly, in all probability. The North Atlantic in November does not prolong things unnecessarily, and it was written finally. We do not have that chapter. We have only the chapter before it, the ship, the barrels, the rope, the log, the open harmonium, the missing faces. But we have enough. We have enough to understand that 10 people were here, that they lived fully and ordinarily right up until the moment they did not, that the sea took them in the specific, impersonal way the sea takes people. Not because they deserved it, not because they had failed, not because the universe had singled them out for a fate commensurate with any particular meaning, but simply because they were in a small boat on a large ocean, and the rope had broken and the ship had gone. We have enough to say their names: Benjamin Spooner Briggs, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, Sophia Matilda Briggs, Albert Richardson, Andrew Gilling, Edward Head, Volkert Lorenzen, Boy Lorenzen, Arian Martins, Gottlieb Gondeschog. 10 names, 10 people, one ship, sailing on without them into the grey November light, patient and intact and carrying all their things, moving toward Gibraltar, moving toward the record, moving across the 150 years between that morning and this one, toward us. The Mary Celeste has arrived. She has told us everything she knows. The rest belongs to the sea.